Well, good evening, guys. Today we've got Aisling with us to do a talk about forecasting for ice cream and her journey to becoming a weather presenter. Just a couple of health and safety things first. First aid, if you need any assistance, come to either me. I'm not first aid trained, but I know that there are people in this room that are. So please do come to me or someone else in a first aid training position. Fire procedures, we aren't planning one. If you do hear it, please do follow all emergency procedures that are set out already. If you're not already an RMetS member, there are many reasons to be one. So you get online copies of our monthly in-house journal, free online access to our full journal portfolio, including the Royal Meteorological Society quarterly journal and also the International Journal of Climatology. We have exclusive monthly members newsletters and discounts at conferences and paid meetings. So definitely worth signing up. Also, if you are a member, you can apply to one of these accreditation schemes. The Chartered Meteorologist is the highest level accreditation for highest level professionals, and for Registered Met for more junior meteorologists as well. And yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Ashley.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to Bernadette. Thank you to James for inviting me to talk today. Thank you so much to WeatherQuest as well. I think we all have a small meteorological world with mutual respect for everybody and admiration. And thank you as well to the students who have joined us today. I hope you take something away from it. So I've had I've gone through many different types of forecasting since I became a forecaster about 15 years ago. And everyone sitting in this room, or if you're listening online, or you've never been a forecaster, I can tell you that no matter who you speak to, their journey will be so unique as to who they forecast for, what they forecast for, the circumstances in which they forecast in. And I chose to talk about forecasting for ice cream because it sounds like a little bit of a joke, but actually, has anybody got any idea how much the forecasting industry is worth for ice cream? Does anyone know how much ice cream industry is in the UK? 1.3 billion pounds. Yeah, so as a commercial forecaster, you may have somebody that you're actually providing a forecasting ice cream for, or a forecast for. It sounds like a funny thing, but actually there's a huge amount of money in it. There's very little that happens in the UK without some sort of a weather forecasting input, whether it's salt going down on the roads, whether it's the rails, whether it's the East Anglian rails and it's too windy for them and they have to slow down. There's very little that actually happens. And so every single forecaster who's ever done a forecast, the aviation industry as well, when you're taking off at an airport, that forecast is all being provided by somebody, and everyone is unique in what they have done, what they've learned, and what they've gone on to do. Very few paths are very similar. So this is forecasting for ice cream, which is probably where I started in this $1.3 billion industry. I've worked with the Department of Marine. I now work with ITV. Previous to that, I was with the Met Office. And within that, I worked for the BBC. And I also worked for the RAF as well. And then my journey started as a commercial forecaster with a company called Meteor Group, and it's now DTN. And I think people in this room probably know, all have colleagues from there. So that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. That's what most people, if you've recognized me from ITV Weather, that's what I look like in work only. So people are often surprised when they actually meet me in person. That's a very specific thing that I do on any one day. And actually the amount of time I spend on screen of my whole working day, which is 10 hours long, is probably about 10%. So I spend 90% of my time doing a lot of other things in the media industry. My job has changed a lot since I joined ITV. It used to be a very specific style of forecasting. Now it's more, I don't like to say fluffy forecasting, but our forecasting is to help people make their basic day-to-day life decisions, not about airplanes lifting and landing, but maybe it's too cold, maybe it's too warm, and you're all the while trying to help people make decisions. That changed for me massively when I became a mother, and I hope it made me a better presenter, because actually I got to a stage where I used to get really frustrated not having all of this information at my fingertips, because I love the weather and I love everything about it, but it actually just came down to a decision of, can I get the boys out in the morning because it's wet or not? And it really made me see media forecasting with different eyes and value it in a very different way. So you can know lots of different things, but can you help people make decisions? They're basic day-to-day decisions about going out or not going out. Perhaps you're elderly. We've had a very cold spell of weather, and we all know that hip fractures go up when the weather is cold. So you're trying to help people make decisions, and that's what every single forecaster is doing. And for me, which now is as a presenter, that's what I do as well. You hope that you can just help people make a better decision and also bring a little bit of light to their day at the end of the news. The news can be really heavy sometimes, and so it's nice to talk about something which we all have in common in the UK, which is our love of the weather. This is my favourite cloud. Any cloud spotters in the room? Anybody know what it is? Okay, so it's an altocumulus cloud flocus with virga. So AKA to me jellyticularis, because it looks like jellyfish going across the sky. So whilst I can't go through all of the decades of my life, I can tell you from a very young age, as far back as I remember, before I knew what a meteorologist was, before I knew what a weather job was, I used to look up at the sky and I think, why are the clouds that way today? How do they know it's going to be warm tomorrow? How do they know it's going to be cold tomorrow? Are we going to get snow? I never remember not being curious about what was happening in the atmosphere around me. And that was from a very young age. But it took me a very long time and many different careers to actually get to where I am now. So I'm just going to give you a little run through of the contents of the presentation so you can nod off at various points. But I've jumped forward a couple of decades to the Department of Marine, and then I'm going to go backwards. So from ITV, Met Office, BBC, I worked at Odium, I was also in the Falklands, and it's in Gatwick Airport as well, a Meteor Group. So I'm going to go from where I am now, backwards in time to where I started as a forecaster. So I actually started for a while in the Department of Marine. So that's actually the whole of Ireland, including all of the waterways in the area. And we've all had moments in our life where, you know, you're on a journey and you have these moments that something happens and you think, oh, that's what I want to do, or I don't want this to happen, I do want that to happen. And for me, there was one weekend in the Department of Marine, it was really high tide, so anomalous spring tides that would have caused flooding. But we got a report in from Met Aaron saying, well, there's high pressure around, so we're not overly concerned this weekend about high tides. And it was sort of that little flick of the switch moment where I was like, I am looking at the wrong thing here. I'm looking at the water, and the thing that I was more interested in was, why was the high pressure? What had that got to do with spring tides, and why shouldn't I be concerned about that? And then that's when I sort of thought, right, I'm starting this all over again, and I'm going to see if I can get into forecasting. And I went back to university again. So, not to brag or anything, I've spent a lot of time in university. So I have a degree and I have a master's in remote sensing and GIS. I also have a master's in meteorology. And I have a level 5 QCF in forecasting, which some of you have as well. So I have an awful lot of interesting things that I think are interesting behind me. The one thing everybody asks me, though, is about my hair and makeup, and do I enjoy getting it done? No matter who you are, that is the question that I normally get asked. And so I wanted to show you a little video of what that answer is. And the answer is absolutely not. I do it all myself, and it's also part of presenting and part of learning is actually doing all of this. So I have to fit all of this into my morning, as well as building my graphics, as well as taking my brief, making sure I'm in the studio on time, doing all the comms checks that we've done here. And this video is about 59 seconds long, and it takes me about 20 minutes to do that now. It didn't always. It used to take me a lot longer. And for whatever reason, people are much more interested in this than any of the forecasting side of it. So that's basically how my morning starts. And as you'll all know, that's all really condensed. By the time you've produced a forecast or sent it off to a customer, you haven't just magicked it up into thin air. You've had to do an awful lot of things. And my job has turned into something where this part of how I represent myself is also quite important as well. So some of my day can look like this. This is a live program, and I'm just standing there chatting. That's what I see from where I'm standing, and that's the gallery. And in that gallery, there's normally lots of people talking in my ear. Sometimes it's chaos, sometimes it's calm, and most of the time I'm pretty equipped at just really drowning out all of the noise and just listening to the count of what's actually been said in my ear and how long I have to talk. That's my green screen. just to say, wherever possible, I try not to wear ridiculous shoes, and I always put my trainers on if my feet aren't going to be seen. Sometimes my leggings if it's really cold as well. But we're very lucky to have a really professional setup at ITV. We have a fantastic green screen, our cameras are brilliant, and our mixers are brilliant as well. So I'm very lucky, but that is what's actually happening there. This is when I turn around, that's where I can see what I'm pointing at. But over time, you just get really used to just pointing into the air, and you just know that it's in the right place. It's just something that you're doing all the time. It's a little bit like motor memory. And then this is basically what my output is of my day. But as I said, that is at most 10% of what I'm actually doing during the day. There's 90% of things that are happening alongside news for me as well. So I'm really lucky I get to go out sometimes and on outside broadcast. That was actually latitude. It's a number of years ago, which you can probably tell from my face. I'm much younger there. That's one of our cameramen. If you're really, really lucky, we might have 2 cameras. It's always a little bit hectic, a little bit busy, and where possible, like you guys as well, like to do a little science explainer. I'm very lucky to have a platform where you get to explain some interesting things that happen in the UK, and that was just something about snow and about the different types of snow and what makes a good snowball, which is just interesting to somebody. We always think, okay, is that interesting down in the pub? Would you tell somebody that little piece of nugget of information? Is it something that you'd like to know in a quiz? And that's what we try to do. And yes, so this is how we actually put together a weather forecast. So I've shown you all of those pictures, but I have found over time doing talks, people much prefer to see it in video. So I'm going to play a video that's about 2 minutes long, so bear with me. And I just want to show you what actually happens.
I'm your local weather presenter. Have you ever wondered how we put a weather forecast together? Yep, this weather forecast behind me. Every day, the ITV weather team creates hundreds of forecasts covering the whole of the UK, and there is a lot that goes into making them. It all starts with observations from land, sea, and space. This information is put into a giant supercomputer to help us understand and predict the most likely weather. We have a briefing with a forecaster from the Met Office, as well as looking at other information available to us. Then we create our weather maps and graphics and choose which charts best tell the weather story. Sometimes it can be tricky to fit all the information into a short broadcast. These larger numbers show the maximum temperature of the day. So 8 degrees here, 11 degrees down here. Behind me, all the blues, this is all of the rain. And these greys here, that's all of the clouds. And where we have the best of the sunshine today is where we can see the green of the land. Once the graphics are ready, it's makeup time. As the lighting we're about to stand under is pretty bright. Finally, we head on into the studio. Once inside, we use a green screen. Our technical team projects the graphics onto the green screen behind me, so it looks like we're standing in front of them. Behind the scenes, the gallery team talk to us through a hidden earpiece. They adjust the camera and tell us when to start and stop talking. Good morning, gallery. It's Aisling today. Can you tell me my talk time? Okay, so your talk time is 1:30. We don't use a script to present the weather. Instead, we use information from the weather brief and our maps here behind us, and we put it all together to tell you the weather story. So what we see is what you see at home. So the next time you see the weather, you'll know exactly how we put it all together.
So as you know, that's all very glammed up and jazzy, but you know the reality of me getting my hair ready. But the bottom line is, what I'm doing is telling a story, and what every weather forecaster is doing is just telling a story. They're trying to tell a story that's useful to their customer, that's helpful in some ways, and some days that forecast is really bland. There's not anything particularly useful, and I'm convinced that we all have a 24-hour memory. So I tend to tell people that you'll only remember if you bought an umbrella yesterday. You won't remember 2 days ago, and you won't care about 2 days ago. But you'll always just remember what happened the day before, and that's where it becomes useful in your storytelling. So do you say, well, not as cold as yesterday, so if people haven't headed out yet, they know how to make decisions. So for me, some of those decisions are really basic, but sometimes they become a little bit more serious. I think we've lost. There we go. So that's just the presentation part of it, and that includes the chat at the end of the day. I always try to come up with something interesting about what's happened with the weather to explain something outside of the actual broadcast. But I do a lot of other things as well. So there's another 90% of my time that I fill in. Sometimes it's just trying to run along with the news. There could be a breaking story, not breaking story. So I'm all the while preparing for a weather chat that is either longer or shorter, or something that will work with the news, that if we need to talk for longer, we have to talk for longer. So I'm always over prepared for absolutely everything. But also do something like this. So I came up with an idea for climate explorers. So I think that we weren't quite represented in a footprint of explaining about the climate. So this was another project that I work on with some of my team that was absolutely fantastic. But I will tell you that it came out of an email that I got. So we receive a lot of emails, and yes, I see most of the emails as well. Some of them are nice, some of them are not so nice. So you need to kind of build a little bit of a wall for yourself when you read some of them. But one of them was just complaining about something that we had done in about the climate, and about how climate change wasn't real. And I just decided, like I mentioned earlier, there's these points where you just make decisions where you're like, right, that's going to become my focus and I'm going to try and do this. Decided the best way to do it is just to come up with this, just so if you Google it, you'll find us and you can find your answer. And they're all in 90 seconds. So they're all really, really quick, really, really easy ways to digest information. So the questions that I get most commonly asked, particularly by children, because they're just absolutely fantastic, and I love doing outreach with schools, but how can I help climate change? I think that's one of the biggest questions that we face all the time. How can I help? And I think that if you actually are a forecaster or you work in climate, you will feel the weight of that every day, because you really know, you really understand the data and really understand what's happening. So sometimes it can feel a little bit heavy, but all of these videos are just designed to answer questions just in really simple ways, because you don't need to know the complexity of it. You just need to tell the story in a really simple way that can be passed on. So I always feel like when you're offering up information, you should be offering that information in a way that somebody isn't trying to learn it. It's just presented in such a simple way that that information is just in their head and they're not having to overthink about what you've just said to them. So simplifying it is actually one of the biggest skills that I've probably learned from working at ITV. Is like, how do I make it simple so that it sticks in someone's head? We all have a million decisions to make every day before we've even left for work, let alone when we're in work and after work. And so if you want to offer up something, you need to make it really simple to somebody. But this was part of what we did at ITV. I also write loads of articles as well. Sometimes you know that I've written them, sometimes you wouldn't know, but that also forms a part of my day too. And there's more of them there. One of my favorite things to do actually is outreach, and there's really personal reasons for this. So when I was growing up in school, I didn't go to a terrible school, but it wasn't a great school, and careers was certainly not something that was ever discussed with me growing up. And I mentioned earlier about how I would look up at the sky and think, wow, how do they know what's going to happen? And no, I didn't know what a weather forecaster was, or I didn't know what a meteorologist was. And I came from a time where I was told, oh, you can't do woodwork in school. It's not a particularly, female orientated subject. So I do come from, a different time frame. And so I just absolutely love going into school. And I'm really lucky ITV factors this in. And so if we get a request in, 9 times out of 10, we'll be able to accommodate them. And I go in and do a little piece and I explain all about the weather and how we measure weather. And then I read some stories at the end. And then I get the kids to do weather forecasts. So I'll normally create them a bespoke forecast. All of the schools have whiteboards now, which was a little shock to me when I first went into it. I was like, what is this whiteboard thing? And we get them to do a little weather forecast. And there's so much in that. You're trying to encourage people to make mistakes, be comfortable making mistakes, talk about the weather, and also equally over time, when I've had people come in visiting us for a work experience, people aren't interested in what they're doing, and that's just as valuable as knowing what you do want to do as what you don't want to do. But I always just hope that the kids just come away with an idea that there's careers in environment, there's careers in climate, and they can all make a little difference each day. And I just hope they're just a touch more curious about science, engineering, and all of those subjects that I didn't feel were accessible to me. And that is a really important part of what I do in my job, and something that I get great joy from as well. I do want to talk a little bit about climate change, so I don't want to bring the tone down, but I think in 2022, when we all saw 40 degrees on the first GFS weather model, And then there was some chat about maybe it being something to do with the soil deficit, and it was dry and these 40 degrees maybe weren't as likely. And then the next day came, and the next ensembles, and the next weather models. And I was really sad. It was genuinely really, really sad. And I had all of these sad moments in work because I was no longer doing a weather forecast. I was doing a public health forecast along with everybody else that was doing public health forecasting. And of all the climate papers I read, of which I still read, I still somehow disbelieved that this was actually going to happen. And we all know that the frequency of it is expected to increase and the longevity of heat in our climate is changing. But I think actually seeing it in your own lifetime is a little bit startling and very upsetting to know how to actually quite manage that in a broadcast as well. When you work in news and media, you're not supposed to really have an opinion about anything. You're supposed to present a two-sided story, and that should be unbiased. So if you see something from one political broadcast, you should see it from the other broadcast. Whether we have a little bit of a leeway where you might say, oh, it's some welcome sunshine or something really basic like that, because you're not really, maybe people don't like sunshine. You're not supposed to actually present it with an opinion. But I found that very hard. And I think anyone in our industry did, and probably still had a little bit of disbelief. And I can only imagine the first medium range forecaster who was looking at that thinking, what is that? What? And like getting everybody to look at it. And it also kind of came at a time as well where I was learning more about scientists. And as scientists, we're not supposed to have an opinion. You're supposed to just present data. So you have a hypothesis and you present data. But actually, we need more scientists having opinions and presenting data in a really simplistic method. We all know our climate stripes and Ed Hawkins. What he does is pretty amazing and has propelled that message even more in the most simplest of way. But I think it is okay to have an opinion about this. And I think that actually it is pretty astonishing that we got 40 degrees. And I remember, this was just very recently, you may remember, this meteorologist becoming upset on air over Storm Milton, and it deepened 50 millibars. And it resonated more than that storm did because of the emotion that was involved. And I think when you're an expert in something, it's okay sometimes to show a little bit of emotion in what you're actually seeing. You have to be helpful and you have to help people through stuff. But I think it is pretty amazing that we are living through this time, and it's a complex one. And how do I help is probably the biggest question for climate change that, I struggle with. And I just spoke about Ed's stripes. So messaging is everything. Messaging, it's storytelling. We all tell stories. That's what we're all doing in our jobs every day. And for me, this storytelling is actually really quite powerful. So if you didn't know anything about climate and you didn't know anything about science, you would understand. If I said to you, this is every single year since the Industrial Revolution, just the colours alone tell a story. And storytelling is really powerful. And it, when it's used in the right way. Little side note, I do, my lovely pal Gemma Plum, we have a podcast called For the Love of Weather. Gemma is an amazing person, an amazing meteorologist, and inspires me every time I sit down and do a podcast with her. It's all done in our spare time and it's all done last minute. And the reason I put that slide here is because I have yet to face a day where I don't want to learn something new. And I've yet to face a day where I don't learn something new in work. And I think when I stop learning, I think then it's time, to move away from what I'm doing, but I still have plenty of interest left. And if you don't know our podcast, you should definitely have a little listen to it. We've had just some incredible guests on. I'm forever overwhelmed by people's generosity with their time and their willingness to speak to us. And our little podcast has turned into this little niche place where we've had people from all sorts of backgrounds that you could possibly imagine come on and talk about the weather, because it is probably the one thing that links us the most in this world, and climate is linked everywhere. But I do love doing this. It's often at the last minute and it's often at the 11th hour, but somehow we manage to get our podcasts out all of the time. So do have a listen. There's something for everybody in there. And the idea is that we want to continue learning, and it's a lovely way to do it, and ever a reminder that a simple message is the best when you just want to take home message of what you're actually listening to. So that was my time at ITV. Has anybody got any questions just so far? No? Before that, I was with the Met Office, so I was sitting on the other side of the camera for a time. Met Office is a wonderful organisation, some brilliant minds, scientists, and I've had some of the most incredible opportunities of my life working with the Met Office, and I feel very privileged that I got to work there. But this is their building down in Exeter. It's lovely. It's probably one of the first real eco buildings that I was aware of. And within the Met Office, under that umbrella, my last job with them was in the BBC. So at that time, they held the BBC contract. So I was the in-house meteorologist briefing all of the weather presenters within the BBC. And that's really where my shift in focus about the customer of the public, about how you need to simplify things, what's helpful, what's not helpful, and also how little 1 minute is, and how may you only have 1 minute to say something really, really important. And I loved my time in the BBC, and I loved all of my colleagues there. And I think if you know anybody that works in weather or climate, they love what they do. They just simply love what they do. And so you're getting to work with people who love what they do all the time. So you may be familiar with that screen there. And I put in some pictures of people who just helped me and inspired me during my time there and just gave me opportunities. And they are just always my reminder that it's so easy to be kind and it's so easy to be helpful. And even if you don't want to help, well, you should, because it all comes back to you in reaps. And I learned so much from them. And I didn't even know I was learning from them. So I sat on that desk watching them and I didn't realize how much I was taking in about media. So I had all of this science coming into my head from the Met Office, and then you see how it's presented. And I realized the value and the simplicity of messaging. And I feel really lucky that I got to work with them. I wanted to put this picture up here because I can see the terror in my eyes. I don't know if you guys can see it too. Aside from being younger, I'm absolutely terrified in that. And I was terrible when I first started off. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about the person who gave me the opportunity to do this. So every day in the BBC, we would have a morning meeting, an editorial meeting, and then you would brief who was ever on shift that day. So let's say during the week there was, I don't know, somewhere between 8 and 10 people there. And the boss at the time, Liz Howell, just said to me, oh, I really like how you are presenting your briefs. Why don't you see how you go in the studio? Doesn't always work out for everybody. And that was literally how all of that started for me. But we were talking about this in the car on the way. And you don't just get handed, these opportunities. But if you really want something and you really love it, and you just keep trying and trying and trying and trying, it's about being ready when the opportunity presents itself. And you can only get ready for the opportunity by doing all of the hard work beforehand. And what you see then is it looks like somebody, oh, they're new. But they've probably been doing something behind the background and working really quite hard to actually do that. But I do like to keep this because it reminds me of how terrified I was and how little I knew. And also, even now, I do some terrible broadcasts. But I've been very lucky and I've worked with some very kind people. But I would hope that it was because I also enjoyed my job and did my best at my job every day. And that looked very different on very different days, whatever your best was. It was also my first real experience of how much the news really trusts an expert. So my biggest example of this I can think of, I don't know if anybody remembers the flooding in Cumbria around 2016. So that was the first time I sat in like a global editorial meeting in the BBC. So I mean, everybody's in there from war correspondents to everybody else. You're just sitting in this meeting, and I sort of like come along, so I was asked to go along. And the person who was leading the meeting said, weather. And I very quickly realized that I had to be quick, I had to be simple. He doesn't care about weather models, he doesn't care about 80%, 90%. He wanted to know places, locations, where lives at risk, what do we need to do, where does the message need to go. Had about 30 seconds to get across that point. And that's what mobilized the news to those locations. And it was just this huge dawning of the power of, being in a job when you're an expert and actually you do have the power to make decisions and your expertise is greatly valued, although perhaps not always in the way that you think about. And it was in that moment I learned very quickly about simple messaging. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the radio. I remember taking this picture of myself that night. It was actually St. Patrick's Day. And I absolutely love the radio, which is probably why I love podcasts. But I just think there's so much power in voice and simple voice and conversation. And in that you hear kindness and expertise and all of those little bits thrown in. And I absolutely loved the radio. So if anyone wants to give me a radio job in the future, I'll happily take it. So that was my time at the BBC. Before then, I was at RAF Odium. So I'm actually a low-flying aviation specialist. That sounds very fancy, but I basically just got very good at forecasting in one little area of the atmosphere, and that was below about 1,000 feet. And when you've got helicopters of all different kinds, you very quickly get very used to looking at weather data in a different way. And for me, that was at below 1,000 feet. And the reality is with these guys, it was really just below 200 feet because they can do anything. They can do absolutely anything. And all the time they're practicing. And I still haven't found a very good way to explain what I took from my time at RAF Odium, but I certainly saw a lot. I wasn't in the military, but I was working alongside with them. And the discipline and equally the niceness and calmness and politeness and reassurance I felt from working there was incredible. And these are absolutely amazing. Does anybody know what this particular aircraft is? Yeah. So these are the aircraft that will lift aircraft out of any situation. They're amazing, and the people who work on these aircraft are you're just in safe hands. You're absolutely in safe hands with them. And I was so lucky when I realised now, this is me hanging out the back of one. So I got to go up the London heli lanes of all places. So, very highly secured area. And I'm just sort of hanging out the back of it, like kind of wondering to myself, how did this happen? How did they let me do this? The video is that short because it was 2014 and you didn't take long videos. But that is how noisy it actually was, and just an absolutely incredible thing to do. I was just so very lucky to do that. But I learned a lot as well about why I should really care between 200 and 300 foot cloud bases. They really matter, and those TAFs are incredibly important. And you realise, and then there's methods of writing them and everything, but I got to know weather data in a very different way with them. And there I am, hanging at the back of it again. I also got to go down to the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic and forecast on Mount Pleasant. So that is the air base down there. And it was quite an experience. I was down there for about 14 weeks, and I don't think I've ever been so glad for all the studying and learning and observing that I did when I was down there. The data at the time was much more limited. Didn't even have a cloud-based recorder. It was 3-hourly satellites. It was in the middle of a winter, and whatever happened in the forecast meant that the whole base might not get off site for the weekend. So everybody knew who you were. And yeah, it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, being down there and realizing actually how important the weather is. And a little throwback to what it must be like to live somewhere where we don't have this information, or they can't forecast for massive thunderstorms, or they don't have the infrastructure to actually know that. And it was just incredible. So this is a C-17. I got to go in that. I was very sick, felt very sick in it. The guys do a lot of practicing down there. And to my right here is, I don't know if you can just make out some lenticular clouds there. So when it's dark, it's in the middle of winter, if you know anything about Mount Pleasant, they have something called rotors. So the airbase was built, and some incredibly dangerous winds. And there's not really too many places you can stop off to take a break until the winds die down. And I remember waking up one morning, and obviously you cannot see anything. And at the time it was in the depths of winter, so in the height of summer here. And I remember this observation standing outside and going, oh my God, there was absolutely no moisture in any of the tephigrams. What are these clouds doing there? So what's actually happening up there? And I had set off a balloon the night before, so they still do a weather balloon, which is done all over the world and which I still look at to this day. and one of the most important things that can happen down there. And these clouds are indicative of these rotors being there. So really hairy forecasting, and perhaps you don't want to be on shift that day. But also a really good example of why you should really trust your forecast, because I was due to go up in an aircraft that day. So did I trust my own forecast? Did I trust my own safety in that forecast? And if the answer is yes, you know that you've done your best on the day. And if it's not, well, then you need to go and redo your forecast again and think, right, somebody's actually up in that airplane. And I was very lucky. I got to visit all the different islands. There's a number of different aircraft down there. They have the Army down there, Marine, and also air as well. No, they weren't. But I did want to tell a little story about down there that still sticks with me to this day. There was a search and rescue one very wild night. I couldn't actually get the balloon off the ground. There was so much eddies. And I'd had 3 failed attempts to the balloon, and really you should only have 2 failed attempts to the balloon. The equipment is expensive and it's very difficult to actually blow up the balloon, get it out of the shed and get it going, because it is your most accurate piece of information that you will get in that moment is where that balloon travels up, so you can see all of the winds in different directions. The waves were 8 to 10 meters in the weather model, so there were probably more than that actually out there. And there had been reports of a fisherman that went overboard and he had a life vest on. And so it was a really funny night for me, because you're like, wow, this is somebody's life and it's your forecast. And for the guys that are down there, they do this type of stuff all the time. They just brief things, they get into helicopters and that's it. And they just do it. But I knew they had a certain amount of time to go in one direction before they had to come back. So they were flying out of the headwind and flying back into a headwind. So if you imagine it was 50 knots at 1,500 feet, which you couldn't see down below, so these guys were probably going to go lower. If you get that forecast wrong, then their fuel is also wrong. And so yes, they make these massive allowances, but in the absence of any weather data on a wild night, there could have been a 10 to 20 knot error in the actual forecast down there. And I will never forget that night as long as I live. And miraculously, they found him and they got him to the hospital, but he didn't make it. And I always think about that. And I think sometimes in weather forecasting, you can underestimate the power of what you're actually doing, but you do make decisions, whether you're gritting, whether a car has to skid, whatever it is you're doing, councils are trying to save money. These decisions do actually weigh on you. And I was, again, just so grateful for the experience I had at that point to understand what I was actually looking at, and slightly terrified at the trust that was being put in me as well. I think that's definitely something. But I had an amazing time there and got to experience things I never would before. There's a colony of penguins and it was just incredible. I had a morning off and I was lucky they had a space on the aircraft because they do tourism down there. They do it really well. And I got to see these penguins and it was, forever something I'm so grateful actually happened. I do want to talk a little bit about balloon shed. I mentioned they let up a weather balloon. One of the most important things that you can do every day. I hated that balloon shed. It was so dark. The type of dark I can't even describe. It terrified me. So I do what I do best. We just come up with some sort of solution for it. And I started inviting people to the balloon shed in the evenings. So it's 11 o'clock at night. You can't see it. It's really windy. And I got people to write messages up to space. And so their balloon went up to space and everybody got a photo of it. But again, always my reminder, if you're uncomfortable doing something, find a way around it. Power on through, find a way to make that work for you. And I got really good at teaching how to, let balloons up as well. But they are one of the most important things that you can have, even now to this day. I'm sure you're all the same. You're looking at the Lark Hill in the morning or wherever else you're forecasting for and thinking, what actually does it look like as you go up through the atmosphere? Oh, I also worked at Gatwick Airport as a civilian aviation forecaster. Totally different beast. They do not care about the 2 seconds that they spend down at 200 or 300 feet. They're looking for different types of forecasting. But this was a role that existed for a while, so you could integrate with the airport, and it was all about helping airlines make better decisions. So do you cancel down planes? do you cancel down passengers and not having all of this situation where maybe there's, I don't know, a couple of thousand people arriving at the airport, but the likelihood is the planes are going to be cancelled. And so it was all about mitigating against all of that. And it was really, really interesting role. And again, another role where I just met such a diverse range of people who were expert in the most random of things. And one of the most interesting stories I heard about was why a New York flight was delayed for 7 hours. Not because of the weather, not because of anything particularly bad that had happened at the airport, but because the cleaning company had forgot to put toilet paper into the toilet. And by the time they were able to actually get some in, the airline people had gone past their, the amount of hours that they can actually fly for. So they had to get a whole new crew in, and it delayed them 7 hours. So I learned a lot working at that airport, and delays are not always for the reasons that you think. But also equally, I think people like to know when there's a delay. I think people are very forgiving if they have information, but it can feel frustrating when you don't have it. And so I think, time has moved on since I started forecasting, but that's what we try to do now, is give as much information as possible so people can make better decisions about what it is that they're doing. And then that brings me back to my IFC, which is where I did some retraining after working with Meteor Group. And I spent 6 months down in Exeter working on their IFC course. It was the most incredible training I've ever got. I've never seen the atmosphere come to life in such a way. And again, I'm forever grateful for that opportunity that I had. And I love my time down there. And I met a whole bunch of very cool people, and very quickly realized actually the weather world is really tiny. We all love what we do, but we might just work for different people. And I really enjoyed it. And then before that was Meteor Group, and that's sort of how I describe myself as a commercial forecaster, where you're kind of working for businesses, not necessarily public sector. So road, rail, some media, power, perhaps the gas lines as well in the North Sea. And that's where ultimately I started my career, and where I met Gemma, who I do the podcast with, who to this day is still my pal, which is awesome. And I learned loads from working there, absolutely loads. But I was so grateful to have moved on to the Met Office. The opportunities were slightly different there, and something for me. And I think that's the thing with every forecaster. We all have very different paths that we're going to take. Some of us cross over. Some of them do very different things, but they do space weather forecasting, global forecasting. And you never know, in another lifetime, or maybe after this career, I'll go on to my next career. And I think space weather will probably be my next one, which is pretty cool. Which brings me back to the Department of Marine again, on the day where I realised I didn't care about the high tides and I cared about the high pressure. And that's the end of my talk. Yeah. So has anybody got any questions? No.
What's been your, you've obviously done a lot.
Yeah.
What's been your favourite weather event that you've covered?
Oh, it's the tricky one, isn't it? Because bad weather isn't always great weather, right?
Yeah,
So.
yeah, I think you're safe here saying that
Yeah.
it's a bad weather event.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so many. I don't know. My favourite weather event.
Okay, what type of thing?
Yeah, I don't know. So I love all of the weathers. I love them all equally. I think seeing just in general how forecasting and communication and messaging has moved on. And the best example I can think of that is the 40 degrees. And by the time we got to that 40 degrees, we're all just so much more tuned in together, from internet, everything. When I started forecasting, we were waiting for information to download off the servers. So the next model run would come in and you'd be waiting 20 to 40, or even 45 minutes, and you wouldn't have access to the weather model. So I think the 40 degree was a massive moment where everything came together, and no matter what you were doing, you had an important job to do. So for me on that day was just messaging continually. 40 degrees is, it's above our body temperature. And watching all of my colleagues around me, whether it was in news or whether it was in the Department of Health, or regardless of where it was, just come together in such a fantastic, united way, and realize actually we have a lot of power in what we do, and what we do is really, really important. And so that was probably one of my highlights, if you want to call that a highlight. Yeah.
Very depressing though, isn't it? Seeing that we see the seasonal forecast comes out every month.
Yeah.
Every month above average temperature.
Yeah, I think this this month in January is the first month in a long time where the mean has been about a degree below. But as you know, that is just like a blip in the trend, and we're no longer surprised. And sometimes, you know, you feel in media anyway, where we may be talking about this kind of to a more general population, rather than what, you know, you guys do, which is really specific with your customer. Just the whole time you're like saying record breaking, record breaking, record breaking, and it is a little unsettling. And you do need a day off sometimes when that type of weather happens, because you really get it, you know, you really get what's happening behind it. And when it's happening within your career lifetime, yeah, it's quite a big deal. Have you guys got any questions? Okay, that's me. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for your time.